Moving to the next slide, after your budget table should be your budget narrative, and that's our next slide here. On the bottom of page 40 into page 41, it talks about the budget narrative. Basically, your budget narrative is where you explain where you got the figures that you put in your budget table. It, as the book says, the budget narrative describes in detail how the costs of each item shown in the budget table were calculated. So in yours, in your projects, they're going to be about, you're asking for about $5,000, but your project might include a much bigger total because you're including that volunteer time, or if you have an employee whose part of their salary should be figured into this, or if there's equipment going to be used, that's part of the calculations. Of course, that's in your total. But then your budget narrative explains where you got all those figures for the budget. So it's very important that you're detailed and specific there. Again, for this project, you could make some things up if it's not something that you could pretty easily research. So for example, if you tell me that it costs $1,000 for each laptop for a student, well, you could get a decent laptop for a lot cheaper. I'm not probably going to accept that unless you really explain to me what exact software is going on that and why it would need to cost so much. Likewise, any materials that you could easily just research and find out at Lowe's or somewhere else for literacy. If you're buying books or something like that, you need to tell me where you got those figures, whether it's Amazon or the Ancilla bookstore, something like that. You might see the term seed money in the budget narrative slide. It says use money as seed so projects can continue. And on page 41, it explains this a little bit more under other issues about how often the funding source, they view it as okay if the money that they're sending is going to go to help get a project started. They don't want to have to keep funding it and keep sending money all the time to keep it continuing. So if you can show that the money that they're investing will help start a project, but then your organization can keep sustaining that project. That's a term called sustainability. We'll talk about that in another module, but just things to keep in mind with your budget narrative. Again, page 41 explains this in more detail. Let's talk about some common mistakes people make when doing a budget for a grant proposal. There are a few things that show up on this next slide, budget mistakes. One is that sometimes people will include in a grant proposal they want money for equipment that's not a direct tie to the grant proposal. In the book, they give the example of somebody else in some department at this organization will say, oh, hey, I could really use a new laptop. Why don't you put that into the grant? And unfortunately, this happens. Sometimes organizations will use grant money to get equipment and items that really have nothing to do with the purpose of that actual grant proposal. And funding organizations can get very upset if they find this out, or if they feel like they've been misled in some way. You also want to be specific. You don't want what they call inadequate detail there on the slide. Again, sometimes people will make things up for the budget. For a grant proposal, in this we're talking real life here, real nonprofit organizations, they'll just kind of take figures but not really be exact with it. Well, the funders aren't going to just send you a bunch of money if you haven't done your homework and know exactly how much something's going to cost. So you don't want to estimate your costs. You want to get real costs. Again, for this project, I can be a little bit more flexible with that because I know you're working on a timeline and you haven't done this before. You also want to avoid what's called padding your budgets. This is a term you might have heard of, padding a resume. Padding a budget is another thing where you inflate the cost because, again, sometimes people want to find ways to get money, and so they'll inflate the cost of what something will, what they say they should expect something to cost, but really it doesn't cost that much. So again, if you're trying to get laptops to help students with literacy and help students do their homework and be able to take them at home and take online classes, etc. And if you're telling the funder, oh well, yeah, $1,000 per laptop should do it. Well, unless there's something really specific, unless there's a really specific reason why that laptop should be that much, and you can detail that and give exact reasons and give a justification, then they might accuse you of padding it and might say, well, the laptops only cost $400 or $500. What are you doing with the rest of that money? And again, organizations unfortunately do pad budgets sometimes. You don't want to do this. Now, this isn't part of this project, but just so you're aware as you're moving forward, you don't want to pad your budget, but it is acceptable to come up with a rate of inflation. Often costs do go up for items, and for example, if you're counting some transportation costs in there, well, the price of gas goes up, and so you might need to figure that your transportation costs will go up from one year to the next if you're working on a 3-year project. Or what would say year-to-year project, you'd want to make sure that inflation costs go in there. Or if part of your program is providing food or something where the costs clearly are going to go up, then fine, do that. As we finish this up, then we're going to move to the next slide, the outline for the budget. So again, you should have a budget table in place and then a budget narratives. These are some other questions that you can see on the slide that will help you as you're putting your budget together, and then putting those figures into your table, and then doing your budget narrative. There are some different questions on that. Again, providing details of what's going to be purchased, brand names, models, cost, a written bid from a vendor attached, or a catalog page. Again, for this project, you don't want to be bothering vendors and getting bids on something that doesn't exist. Now, if some of you have chosen to work with an organization and they really do want to use this, then fine, they can go out and get that bidder information and you can put that in there. But for this project, just do the best you can with those estimations and I'll work with that.